Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really digging into something complex. It's the history behind a difficult relationship between Thailand and its neighbor.
Mm.
The sources we've looked at point to this like deep historical pattern, and it raises a big question. One the material keeps coming back to when history kind of comes back to bite you, and it's happening on your own soil.
Yeah.
How do you handle that? Perceived disrespect, maybe even betrayal. Now I get it. That sounds maybe a bit intense to start with. And yeah, some historical stuff can be, uncomfortable to hear. But the aim here today for this deep dive is really just to shed light on what our source material is saying. We're not here to judge.
Exactly, and that's the key thing. What's really striking in these sources is how history, when you look at it this way, through these documents, it doesn't really lie. That discomfort you mentioned, often it just pops up when the facts sort of bump up against what people already believe. It makes you look again.
Right. So our mission really is to unpack this long-running story, this historical narrative of the relationship. We want to understand the patterns that keep showing up and maybe think about what that means for today. But like you said, we're just presenting what's in the material, not picking sides. Okay, so let's get into this central idea. The materials we dove into use this really strong metaphor for the relationship with one neighbor in particular, historically called Lawaek. And just to clarify, Lawaek isn't just some random name, right? It's an older term, often pointing towards the Khmer people or the Cambodian kingdom, especially during times of rivalry.
Mm-hmm.
And the sources describe Lawaek as a, quote, spear in Thailand's side. That's pretty powerful imagery that suggests it's not just a one-off issue, but something constant of vulnerability.
It really is striking how consistent the sources are on this point. They give examples. They show how historically, whenever Thailand was facing serious threats from outside, powerful enemies like Burma,
Okay.
this neighbor, Lawaek, would, well, the sources put it bluntly, stab them in the back. But then the flip side was when Thailand got strong again, stabilized things, these same neighbors would come back. They'd offer tribute, try to get back in favor. And importantly, the sources really stress to this, there were no apologies mentioned, no real remorse. It was just strategic self-preservation.
That brings up something really interesting the sources touch on why.
Huh.
Why put up with that repeatedly?
Yeah.
And one idea floated is that maybe Thai culture's tendency towards forgiveness, which is usually seen as a good thing, a virtue maybe that becomes a kind of weakness in these political or conflict situations.
Mm-hmm.
It really makes you, the listener, think, can that cultural grace, that desire for harmony, actually turn into a vulnerability that others might, take advantage of?
The sources definitely push us to think about that.
Right.
Yeah, they suggest that what we might see as a strength, being forgiving could, in certain contexts, historical, political, become something others exploit. It's a complex point they're making.
Okay, so let's bring this forward. From that sort of ancient history to now to the modern day, the sources ask this pretty direct, maybe even uncomfortable question. Why does this old Lawaek mindset, as they call it, still seem to crop up with certain unnamed contemporary leaders mentioned in the material? How does that old pattern show up today?
It's a really critical connection the sources are trying to make.
Yeah.
They basically argue that, okay, the names change, the specific situations change, but the core thinking, that stays the same. And what's powerful in the material are the very specific examples they point to, like benefiting from Thailand, using its resources, its opportunities.
Right.
But then at the same time, working against Thai interests when it suits them. There's even this one quote they highlighted, apparently from a recording, where someone says something like, no matter what, I have to support him, talking about some modern leader. Whatever he wants, just give it to him. The sources present that as a direct echo of the old pattern, a kind of modern exploitation maybe. And it forces you to ask, does that sort of thing undermine national dignity?
And tied into that, the sources talk about this frustration, especially among younger people in Thailand. There's this feeling described like, hey, living on Thai soil, whether you're just visiting or residing here, it shouldn't mean you have to act like you're, secondary, like a subordinate nation.
Yeah.
It does make you think about national pride, about sovereignty, especially when these historical echoes suggest a kind of subservience almost.
Exactly. And the sources really focus on what they term the dilemma of a weak leader,
Mm.
which isn't just about, personal toughness. It's about the huge pressures, the really tough choices leaders face when they're trying to navigate these old patterns, these perceived betrayals,
Sure.
while also trying to keep national dignity intact and protect the country's interests. The material suggests it's a really, really difficult balancing act.
Shifting gears a bit, the sources get into some fascinating specifics on land claims. You mentioned this before. Based on the material, this idea that the original maps for places like Angkor Wat, Angkor Thom, they actually showed them as part of Thailand.
Yes, I can absolutely reiterate that. The materials we went through are very specific here. They cite French colonial maps, actual maps from that era that clearly mark those famous sites as Siam.
Siam, yeah.
Even models, like architectural models they had in Paris showcasing these places, labeled Siam.
Wow.
And the explanation given in the sources is that Thailand lost that territory, not because of a direct fight with the neighbor over it, but because Thailand lost a war to France.
Okay.
And France then used its colonial power to redraw the lines, essentially pushing those areas towards Cambodia. That's the account in the sources.
Okay, so as we're talking about this, I can almost hear the pushback the sources anticipate. The worry, hey, if we talk about this history, aren't people going to accuse us of, putting others down?
Yeah.
Disparaging them.
Right, and that's a really important point the sources tackle head on. They argue, look, presenting historical facts, especially when you have evidence like old maps, it's not about saying one group is better or worse.
Right.
It's just about truth, about what the historical record shows. And then they end that part with a pretty sharp statement, kind of aimed at anyone in that situation, living on a country's land, but not showing any gratitude for the peace or opportunities you get there.
So, okay, pulling all this together, what's the way forward? According to these sources, how does Thailand get out of this loop, this spear in the side thing that seems to run through history?
Well, looking broadly, the sources suggest Thailand needs to take a hard look at its relationships, particularly with neighbors who maybe aren't acting like true friends. They argue history shouldn't just be remembered. It should make Thais dare to speak about these things, and critically, dare to protect their sovereignty. It's about setting boundaries.
So it's like redefining what loving your neighbors means. The sources seem to say, forget the idea that it means you just let them walk all over you.
Precisely, yeah. The material makes a strong case for needing the courage to just state clearly, this country is Thailand. And if some people don't like hearing that, well, the sources basically say that's their problem because we are not afraid. It's a call for self-respect, for national assertion.
We've certainly covered a lot today, a real deep dive into some profound insights from looking at this Thai Khmer history. It highlights these cycles, these historical patterns, and really underlines why remembering and learning from that past is so important. It's challenging stuff, but as the sources show, pretty necessary for understanding things today.
Absolutely. And maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. If it's true that history repeats itself when people forget, what responsibility does that place on each person, each citizen, to make sure that history isn't silenced? And how does knowing that history affect the courage needed collectively to protect what you believe is rightfully yours? Something to think about.